The cashless welfare card is a policy that restricts the spending choices and autonomy of First Nations people in Australia. It was introduced in 2007 as part of the Northern Territory Intervention, which suspended the Racial Discrimination Act and imposed harsh measures on Indigenous communities. The card holds 50% or 80% of a welfare recipient's payments and can only be used on essentials like groceries, rent, and bills. It cannot be used to buy alcohol, tobacco, gambling products, or gift cards. The government claims that the card is designed to reduce social harm and improve financial management among welfare recipients. However, there is little evidence to support these claims. In fact, several studies have found that the card has negative impacts on the well-being, dignity, and human rights of First Nations people. Some of these impacts include increased hardship and poverty. The card limits access to cash, which is needed for many everyday expenses such as transport, phone credit, school fees, and secondhand goods. It also reduces the ability to save money, bargain for discounts, or access emergency funds. Many cardholders report running out of money, going without food or essentials, or relying on charity or family for help. Stigma and discrimination. The card marks First Nations people as welfare dependents and problem spenders, reinforcing negative stereotypes and racism. It also makes them feel ashamed, embarrassed, and humiliated when using the card in public or when it is declined by merchants. Some cardholders avoid social interactions, withdraw from community activities, or experience depression and anxiety due to the card. Loss of control and agency. The card undermines the self-determination and autonomy of First Nations people, who are forced to comply with a paternalistic and punitive policy that does not respect their choices or preferences. It also erodes their cultural values and practices, such as sharing resources, caring for kin, and participating in ceremonies. Some cardholders feel disempowered, frustrated, and angry about the card and the lack of consultation or consent involved in its implementation. The cashless welfare card is not a solution to the complex social and economic challenges faced by First Nations people. It is a form of structural violence that violates their rights, dignity, and culture. It is time to end this harmful policy and instead invest in community-led initiatives that empower First Nations people to achieve their aspirations and potential. The cashless welfare card is a form of income management that restricts how welfare recipients can spend their money. It was introduced by the Australian government as a way to reduce social problems such as alcohol and drug abuse, gambling, and violence in some communities. However, many First Nations people have opposed the card, saying it is discriminatory, paternalistic, and harmful to their culture and dignity. One of the ways the cashless welfare card affects the cultural practices and traditions of First Nations people is by limiting their access to cash, which is often needed for hunting, fishing, ceremonies, and art. These activities are not only sources of food, income, and identity for many Indigenous people, but also ways of maintaining their connection to their land, ancestors, and spirituality. For example, some First Nations people in Seduna, South Australia, where the card was trialed, reported that they could not buy petrol or bait for fishing, or pay for permits or transport to access their traditional hunting grounds. They also said they could not participate in cultural events such as funerals or festivals that required cash donations or gifts. Some Indigenous artists said they could not buy materials or sell their artworks because many art centers and buyers did not accept the card. Another way the cashless welfare card affects the cultural practices and traditions of First Nations people is by undermining their autonomy, agency, and self-determination. Many Indigenous people see the card as a form of control and surveillance that stigmatizes them as irresponsible and incapable of managing their own affairs. They also feel that the card does not address the root causes of social disadvantage and marginalization that affect their communities, such as poverty, racism, trauma, and lack of services. Instead of imposing a one-size-fits-all solution that ignores the diversity and complexity of First Nations cultures and realities, many Indigenous people have called for more respectful and inclusive approaches that recognize their rights, voices, and aspirations. They have also advocated for more investment in evidence-based programs that support their well-being, such as education, health, housing, employment, and community development. The cashless welfare card is not just a policy issue, but a human rights issue that affects the dignity and culture of First Nations people. By restricting their access to cash and imposing a paternalistic regime on their lives, the card denies them the freedom and opportunity to practice their traditions and express their identity. It also fails to address the structural and historical factors that contribute to their disadvantage and disempowerment. The cashless welfare card is not a solution, but a problem that needs to be challenged and changed. The cashless welfare card is a policy that restricts how welfare recipients can spend their Social Security benefits. It aims to reduce harm caused by alcohol, gambling, and drug use, but it also stigmatizes and discriminates against First Nations people and undermines their dignity and human rights. First, the cashless welfare card violates the principle of informed choice in financial services. Unlike other Australians, First Nations people on welfare are forced to use a card that limits their access to cash and restricts where they can shop and what they can buy. They are not given the option to opt out or consent to this arrangement. This is contrary to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making on matters that affect them. Second, the cashless welfare card perpetuates a history of financial discrimination and control over First Nations people. For decades, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers had their wages and entitlements withheld, mismanaged, or stolen by government institutions that claimed to protect them. These policies contributed to the poverty and disadvantage that many First Nations people still face today. The cashless welfare card echoes these practices by treating First Nations people as incapable of managing their own money and imposing a paternalistic system that denies them financial autonomy and agency. Third, the cashless welfare card stigmatizes and humiliates First Nations people by marking them as different and inferior. The card is easily identifiable by its color and design, which makes it obvious to others that the user is on welfare and subject to income management. This can lead to shame, embarrassment, and discrimination when using the card in public places. Many First Nations people have reported feeling judged, stereotyped, and harassed because of the card. The card also creates practical difficulties and barriers for accessing essential goods and services, such as health care, education, transport, and cultural activities. The cashless welfare card is not a solution to the complex social and economic issues that affect First Nations people. It is a harmful and oppressive policy that infringes on their rights, dignity, and well-being. It should be abolished immediately and replaced with a voluntary and respectful system that supports First Nations people to achieve their aspirations and goals.